Every night for 2 years, Jacob Reed set 4 plates at the table even though only 2 people sat down to eat. One for him, one for his daughter, Emma, one for the memory of his wife, Sarah, who died bringing their second child into a world that took them both, and one for whoever God saw fit to send his way, because Sarah had always said an empty chair was an invitation the universe couldn't ignore. On a Thursday in October, when the wind carried the smell of early snow and the last light bled orange across the Montana hills, a woman appeared at his gate. She was thin, road-worn, and carrying nothing but a canvas bag and a look in her eyes that said she'd been walking towards something she couldn't name. Jacob offered her the empty chair. Emma, 6 years old and too wise for her age, sat down, looked at the woman's face, and said one word that stopped Jacob's heart: Mama. Before the stranger could speak, before Jacob could breathe, Emma smiled like she'd been waiting her whole life for someone to fill that chair. And the woman, this stranger with dust on her boots and secrets in her silence, started to cry. Jacob Reed had learned to live with ghosts. Not the kind that rattled chains or whispered in empty hallways, but the quieter kind, the ones that sat in chairs that stayed empty, the ones that left shapes in the bed where warmth used to be, the ones that made a man set an extra plate at supper even though he knew no one was coming to fill it. Sarah had been gone 2 years, 2 months, and 11 days. Not that Jacob was counting, except he was. Every morning when he woke up alone. Every evening when he cooked for 2 and pretended it was enough. Every night when he tucked Emma into bed, and she asked, in that small voice children use when they're trying not to hurt you, "Is Mama watching us from heaven, Papa?" And Jacob would say yes, because what else could a father say when his daughter's eyes were too big and too sad for a 6-year-old? The ritual had started the week after Sarah's funeral. Jacob had been standing in the kitchen, staring at the stove, trying to remember how to make something that wasn't coffee or despair. Emma had come in, dragging her stuffed rabbit by one ear, and said, "Mama always set 4 plates." Jacob had looked at the cupboard, at the stack of dishes they'd gotten as a wedding gift from Sarah's aunt. 4 plates. One for him, one for Sarah, one for Emma, and one, always one, for whoever might need a meal and a place to rest. Sarah had been like that. She'd believed in open doors and full tables, in the kind of hospitality that didn't ask questions first. "We're only 3 now, sweetheart," Jacob had said gently. Emma had shaken her head, solemn as a preacher. "Mama said the extra plate was for people who needed us. We still need to set it, Papa, in case someone comes." So Jacob had set 4 plates, and he'd kept setting them, night after night, even when no one came, even when the neighbors stopped bringing casseroles and the preacher stopped checking in, and the world moved on the way the world does, leaving Jacob and Emma in a house that felt too big and too quiet. Until tonight. Jacob had been mending a fence post when he saw her. The sun was low, painting everything gold and orange, and for a second he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. But no, there she was, standing at the gate like she'd been walking for days and had finally run out of road. She was younger than him, maybe 30, with dark hair pulled back in a braid that had come half undone. Her clothes were worn but clean, the kind of worn that comes from use and not neglect. She carried a canvas bag slung over one shoulder and nothing else. No horse, no wagon, just her and the dust on her boots. Jacob set down the hammer and walked toward her, slow and careful, the way you approach a deer that might bolt. She didn't run. She just stood there, one hand on the gate, watching him with eyes that were brown and tired, and trying very hard not to hope for anything. "Evening," Jacob said, stopping a few feet away. "Evening," she replied. Her voice was soft, a little hoarse, like she hadn't used it much lately. "You lost?" Jacob asked. She hesitated, then shook her head. "Not lost, just walking." "Long walk from anywhere to here," Jacob observed. "I know." She shifted the bag on her shoulder. "I saw your gate. Saw the smoke from your chimney. Thought maybe—" She trailed off, looking embarrassed. "I thought maybe you might have water. Or, I don't know. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have bothered you." She started to turn away, and Jacob felt something twist in his chest. Sarah's voice, clear as day, echoing in his memory. "The extra plate is for people who need us." "Wait," Jacob said. She stopped. "When's the last time you ate?" he asked. Her jaw tightened. "Yesterday morning, maybe the morning before." "I lose track," Jacob nodded. "We're about to sit down to supper. There's a place at the table if you want it." She stared at him like he'd just spoken a language she'd forgotten she knew. "You don't know me." "No," Jacob agreed. "But my wife used to say that's why the table's big enough for strangers." Her eyes filled with tears so quickly, It startled them both. She blinked them back, hard, and nodded once. "Thank you." Jacob opened the gate and led her toward the house. Emma was on the porch, her rabbit tucked under one arm, watching them with the kind of curiosity only children have, the kind that doesn't judge, just observes. "Emma," Jacob said, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name." "Claire," the woman said quietly. "Claire Donovan. Miss Donovan's going to join us for supper," Jacob continued. "Can you show her where to wash up?" Emma nodded, solemn and important, and took Claire's hand, without hesitation. Jacob watched them go inside, his daughter leading a stranger through the door like it was the most natural thing in the world. Inside, the kitchen smelled of stew and fresh bread, the kind of smell that made a house feel like a home even when it was half empty. Jacob ladled food into bowls, while Claire washed her hands at the basin, her movements careful and deliberate, like she was afraid she might break something if she moved too fast. Emma set the table, 4 plates, like always. 1 for Jacob, 1 for herself, 1 for the memory, and 1 for Claire. Except tonight, for the first time in 2 years, all 4 chairs had bodies in them. They sat down, and Jacob said a brief grace, more out of habit than faith if he was being honest, and then they ate. Claire ate like someone who'd been hungry for a long time, not frantically, but with a focus that said food was a luxury she didn't take for granted. Emma watched her, fork halfway to her mouth, eyes wide and thoughtful. "Do you have a family, Miss Donovan?" Emma asked suddenly. Jacob winced. "Emma, that's not—" "It's all right," Claire said softly. She set down her spoon. "I did. Once. But I lost them." Emma nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "We lost Mama," she said. "She went to heaven with the baby. Papa says she's watching us." Claire's face did something complicated, grief and recognition, and something else Jacob couldn't name. "I'm sure she is," Claire said, her voice thick. Emma tilted her head, studying Claire the way she studied birds or clouds or anything else that didn't quite fit into the neat boxes the world tried to put things in. "You look sad," she said finally. "I am sad," Claire admitted. "But your papa's stew is helping." Emma smiled, satisfied. Then she pointed to the empty chair, the one next to Claire, the one that usually held only memory. "That's Mama's chair," she said, "but she doesn't need it anymore. You can sit there if you want." Jacob's throat went tight. He started to say something, to explain, to apologize for his daughter's bluntness, but before he could, Emma stood up, walked around the table, and climbed into Claire's lap. Claire froze, her arms hovering uncertainly, like she didn't know what to do with a child-shaped weight pressing into her chest. Emma looked up at her, small hands resting on Claire's worn sleeves, and said, clear as a bell ringing across a valley, "Mama." The room stopped breathing. Claire's face crumpled. She wrapped her arms around Emma and started to cry, quiet, shaking sobs that she tried to muffle against the top of Emma's head. Emma didn't pull away. She just sat there, small and steady, like she'd been waiting her whole life for someone to hold and someone to hold her back. Jacob sat across from them, his own eyes burning, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles went white. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know what to do. All he knew was that something had just shifted in the house, in the air, in the careful distance he'd been keeping between himself and the possibility of hope. After a long moment, Claire pulled back just enough to look at Emma. "Sweetheart," she said, her voice raw, "I'm not your mama." "I know," Emma said simply. "But you could be." Claire let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She looked at Jacob, helpless and terrified, and something else, something like hope, trying not to get too loud. Jacob swallowed hard. "Emma," he said gently, "Miss Donovan is a guest. She's sad like you, Papa," Emma interrupted, still looking at Claire. "And she doesn't have anywhere to go. Mama always said we were supposed to help people who didn't have anywhere to go." Jacob closed his eyes. Sarah, always Sarah, reaching out from wherever she was, reminding him that the world didn't stop just because grief made it feel like it should. When he opened his eyes, Claire was watching him, her arms still around Emma, her face wet with tears. "I don't want to intrude," she said quietly. "I can leave. I should leave." "No," Emma said firmly, tightening her grip on Claire's sleeve. "You have to stay. Mama's chair is for you." Jacob looked at the empty chair, at Claire, at his daughter, who had spent 2 years learning how to be brave in a world that had taken her mother and left her with a father who was doing his best, but knew it wasn't enough. "Stay," he heard himself say, "at least for tonight. We can figure out the rest tomorrow." Claire nodded, tears still streaming down her face. "Okay," she whispered. Okay. Emma smiled, bright and certain, and settled back into Claire's arms like she'd found exactly what she'd been looking for. And Jacob, who had spent 2 years setting an empty plate and not believing anyone would ever come to fill it, felt something crack open in his chest, something that hurt and healed at the same time, something that felt dangerously close to hope. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of snow. Inside, 4 people sat at a table that had been set for this moment all along, even if none of them had known it was coming. And somewhere, Jacob thought, Sarah was smiling. Jacob woke to the smell of coffee. Not the weak, half-hearted coffee he usually made while Emma slept, but real coffee, strong enough to remind him what morning was supposed to feel like. For a moment, still caught in the space between sleep and waking, he thought Sarah was in the kitchen. His heart leapt, then crashed the way it always did when memory played tricks on him. He sat up, rubbed his face, and remembered. Claire, the stranger. Emma calling her Mama, like it was the simplest truth in the world. He pulled on his boots and walked into the kitchen, half expecting to find the house empty, the whole thing a dream his lonely mind had invented. But no, Claire was there, standing at the stove, her back to him, stirring something in the pot. She'd braided her hair properly, and she was wearing one of Sarah's old aprons, the one with the faded blue flowers that Jacob hadn't been able to bring himself to pack away. "Morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. Claire turned, startled. "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. I woke up early, and Emma was still asleep, and I thought I could at least make myself useful. I hope you don't mind that I—" She gestured at the apron, suddenly self-conscious. "It's fine," Jacob said quickly. "It's good. Sarah would have wanted it used." Claire nodded, relief crossing her face. "There's coffee, and I found some oats. I made porridge. I hope that's all right." "More than all right," Jacob said. He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, watching her work. She moved with the kind of efficiency that came from practice, from years of cooking in small spaces and making do with what was available. "You didn't have to do this," he added. "I know," Claire said, "but you fed me. Let me sleep under your roof." "It's the least I can do." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the kind of silence that happens between 2 people who don't know each other but are suddenly sharing a kitchen at dawn. "Emma really took to you," Jacob said finally. Claire's hands stilled on the spoon. "She's a sweet girl." "She is," Jacob agreed, "but she's also been lonely. She doesn't say it, but I can tell. She misses her mother, and I can't—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "I can't be both parents. I try, but I'm not Sarah. I don't know how to braid hair or talk about the things little girls need to talk about. I do my best." Claire turned to face him, her expression soft with understanding. "You're doing more than your best," she said quietly. "She's lucky to have you." Jacob shook his head. "She called you Mama last night." "I know," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know what to say." "Neither did I," Jacob admitted. He took a sip of coffee, letting the heat ground him. "But she doesn't do that. She's never done that, not with anyone, not even with her aunt, who's tried. Emma knows the difference between her mother and other people, so when she said it to you—" He trailed off. "She was just being kind," Claire said. "Children do that. They see someone sad, and they try to fix it." "Maybe," Jacob said. "Or maybe she saw something I didn't." Before Claire could respond, Emma appeared in the doorway, her hair a wild tangle and her rabbit tucked under her arm. She rubbed her eyes, blinked at Claire, and then her whole face lit up like the sun had just decided to live in the kitchen. "You're still here," Emma said, running over and wrapping herself around Claire's legs. Claire's hands hovered for a moment, then settled gently on Emma's head. "I'm still here," she said softly. "Are you staying?" Emma asked, looking up with eyes too hopeful to be safe. Claire glanced at Jacob, uncertainty written all over her face. Jacob cleared his throat. "Miss Donovan is our guest, Emma. She can stay as long as she needs. But she's not—" "Can I show her the barn?" Emma interrupted, already tugging on Claire's hand. "And the chickens, and the place where Mama's flowers used to grow." Jacob started to say no, to remind Emma that Claire was a stranger, that they didn't know anything about her, that it wasn't safe to get attached. But then he saw the way Claire was looking at his daughter, like Emma was a candle in a dark room and Claire had been walking in the dark for a very long time. "All right," Jacob said, "but let Miss Donovan eat first." They ate together, the 3 of them, and it felt so normal that it scared Jacob. Emma chattered about the chickens and the cow and the way the creek froze in winter. Claire listened, asking questions, smiling at the right moments, and Jacob watched them both, trying to figure out how a stranger had walked into his life less than 24 hours ago, and already felt like she'd been there all along. After breakfast, Emma dragged Claire outside, and Jacob watched from the porch as they walked toward the barn, Emma's small hand firmly clasped in Claire's. He told himself he was just making sure they were safe, but really, he was trying to understand what he was feeling, this strange mix of grief and guilt and something that felt dangerously close to relief. By midday, the neighbors had started showing up. That was the problem with small towns. News traveled faster than good sense. Mrs. Fletcher from the next ranch over arrived first, carrying a pie that was clearly an excuse to get a look at the stranger Jacob had taken in. Then came Mr. Dawson, who claimed he needed to borrow a tool but really wanted to know if Jacob had lost his mind. By early afternoon, half the county seemed to have found a reason to stop by. Jacob stood on the porch, fielding questions with a patience he didn't feel. Yes, Claire was staying for a bit. No, she wasn't family. No, he didn't know much about her. Yes, Emma was fine. No, it wasn't what they were thinking. People will talk, Jacob, Mrs. Fletcher said, lowering her voice like gossip required a whisper. A strange woman in your house. No explanation, no chaperone. You know how it looks. Let them talk, Jacob said flatly. Claire needed help. I helped, that's all. Is it? Mrs. Fletcher asked, her eyes sharp. Because your Emma's calling her Mama, from what I hear. Jacob's jaw tightened. Emma's 6 years old. She doesn't understand. She understands more than you think, Mrs. Fletcher interrupted. And so do I. That woman's trouble, Jacob. Mark my words. Before Jacob could respond, Claire appeared at the barn door, Emma beside her. Claire's face was flushed, her expression tight, and Jacob realized she'd heard every word. Mrs. Fletcher had the decency to look embarrassed. She muttered something about needing to get home and left quickly, taking her pie with her. The others followed one by one, until it was just Jacob, Claire, and Emma standing in the yard. I should go, Claire said quietly, not looking at him. I'm causing problems. You're not, Jacob said, but his voice lacked conviction. She's right, though, Claire continued. People will talk, and Emma... Her voice broke. Emma doesn't need to get attached to someone who's just passing through. Are you? Jacob asked. Just passing through? Claire finally looked at him, and the pain in her eyes was so raw it made him take a step back. I don't know, she said. I don't know where I'm going. I've been walking for 3 months, ever since... She stopped, shook her head. It doesn't matter. It does, Jacob said. If you're staying, it does. Claire opened her mouth, then closed it. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the edges from being handled too many times. This is why I left, she said, handing it to him. But I can't read it anymore. Every time I try, She trailed off, tears spilling down her cheeks. Jacob unfolded the paper carefully. It was a letter, written in a careful hand, dated 3 months ago. He read it once, then again, his chest tightening with each word. When he finished, he looked up at Claire, who was watching him with the expression of someone waiting for judgment. You lost your whole family, Jacob said quietly. Claire nodded, unable to speak. Fire, Jacob said, reading the word again. Your husband, your 2 daughters, all at once. I was visiting my sister, Claire whispered. I was gone one night, just one. And when I came back, she broke, sobbing, and Jacob didn't think. He just stepped forward and pulled her into his arms, the letter still clutched in his hand. Emma ran over and wrapped her arms around both of them, her small voice fierce. Don't cry, Mama. We're here. We're here. And Jacob, holding a broken woman and his grieving daughter, realized that maybe Sarah's empty chair hadn't been waiting for just anyone. Maybe it had been waiting for Claire all along. Claire stayed, not because Jacob asked her to, though he did quietly after Emma had gone to bed that first night, but because leaving felt like giving up on the last thread of life she had left to hold on to. The ranch became her anchor, Emma became her reason to wake up, and Jacob became the quiet presence that reminded her she wasn't as broken as she thought. The days fell into a rhythm. Claire cooked, Jacob worked the land. Emma followed them both, chattering about everything and nothing, filling the silence with the kind of noise that makes a house feel lived in. The neighbors kept watching, kept whispering, but Jacob stopped caring, and Claire stopped listening. 3 weeks after Claire arrived, Emma asked if she could go through Sarah's things. Jacob had been avoiding Sarah's trunk for 2 years. It sat in the corner of his bedroom, locked and untouched, filled with the clothes and keepsakes he hadn't been able to look at without feeling like he was drowning. But Emma had been different lately, braver, lighter, and when she asked her small hand on the trunk's lid, Jacob found he couldn't say no. They opened it together, the 3 of them, in the late afternoon when the light came soft through the windows. Emma sat between Jacob and Claire, her eyes wide as Jacob lifted the lid, and the smell of lavender and cedar drifted up. Sarah's smell, preserved in fabric and memory. Inside were dresses, simple, worn but carefully folded, a shawl Sarah had knitted, a pair of gloves, a locket with a strand of Emma's baby hair inside, and at the very bottom, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with time, a wedding dress. Emma reached for it, her small fingers gentle. "Mama's dress," she whispered. Jacob nodded, his throat tight. "She wore it when we got married 15 years ago." Claire sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, like she was trying to take up as little space as possible. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Emma pulled the dress out, holding it up to the light. It was simple, cream-colored, with lace at the sleeves and a row of tiny buttons down the back. Not fancy, but made with love. "Can Miss Claire wear it?" Emma asked suddenly. Jacob blinked. "What?" "Mama's dress," Emma said, turning to look at him with those serious eyes that always made him feel like she could see straight through to the parts of him he kept hidden. "Can Miss Claire wear it, so we can see what Mama looked like on her wedding day?" Claire shook her head quickly. "Emma, I couldn't—" "Please," Emma said, and there was something in her voice, something desperate and hopeful and so achingly sincere that neither Jacob nor Claire had the heart to refuse. Claire looked at Jacob, silently asking permission. He stared at the dress, at his daughter's face, at the woman who had walked into his life and somehow made it feel less like a graveyard and more like a place where things could still grow. "All right," he said finally, "if Claire's willing." Claire took the dress with trembling hands, disappeared into the spare room, and came back 10 minutes later looking like a ghost. Not because she was pale or frightening, but because the dress fit her the way it had fit Sarah, perfectly, like it had been made for her bones. She stood in the doorway, uncertain, her hair falling loose around her shoulders. Emma gasped, her eyes filling with tears. "She looks like Mama," she whispered. Jacob couldn't speak. He just stared, his heart doing something complicated in his chest. Claire didn't look like Sarah. Not really. Sarah had been blonde and sturdy, with a laugh that could fill a room. Claire was dark-haired and quiet, with sadness etched into the lines of her face. But in that dress, in that moment, she looked like hope, like the future Jacob hadn't let himself imagine. "Emma," Claire said gently, kneeling down so they were eye-level. "I'm not your mama. I can wear her dress, but I can't be her." Emma reached out and touched the lace at Claire's sleeve. "I know," she said, "but Mama said we're supposed to love the people who need us, and you need us, and we need you." She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. "So maybe you don't have to be Mama. Maybe you can just be Mama Claire." Claire's face crumpled. She pulled Emma into her arms and sobbed, quiet, shaking sobs that Jacob knew came from a place too deep for words. Emma held her, patting her back the way Sarah used to do when Emma had nightmares. Jacob stood and walked over, crouching beside them. He didn't say anything. He just put his hand on Claire's shoulder and let her cry, because sometimes that's all a person can do, bear witness to someone else's pain and refuse to look away. That night, after Emma had fallen asleep, Jacob and Claire sat on the porch together. The stars were out, cold and bright, and the wind carried the smell of frost. Claire had changed out of the dress, but Jacob could still see her in it, could still see the way it had made her look like she belonged. "Thank you," Claire said quietly, "for letting me wear it, for letting me stay, for not asking questions I'm not ready to answer." "You don't owe me anything," Jacob said. "I owe you everything," Claire countered. "You saved my life. You don't know that, but you did. She stopped, took a breath. "I was walking toward the river. The day I showed up at your gate, I was going to walk into it and not come back out." Jacob's blood went cold. "Claire, I know," she said quickly. "I know it's wrong, I know it's cowardly, but I didn't know how to keep going. And then I saw your gate and your chimney and I thought, maybe I'll stop here, maybe I'll eat one more meal, maybe I'll see one more sunrise. And then Emma called me Mama and her voice broke. I didn't know I could still feel something besides pain." Jacob reached over and took her hand, rough and calloused from work, and held it tight. "You're not alone anymore," he said. "You hear me? You're not alone." Claire nodded, tears streaming down her face. They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped, stars wheeling overhead, two broken people learning how to hold each other up. Inside, Emma stirred in her sleep and murmured, "Mama Claire," and smiled. A week later, the preacher came by, not to gossip or to lecture, but to check in, because that's what good preachers do when they hear a man might be drowning. Jacob met him on the porch, offered him coffee, and braced for a sermon he didn't want to hear. But the preacher just sat down, looked at Jacob with kind, tired eyes and said, "How are you, son?" Jacob didn't know how to answer that. "I'm managing," he said finally. The preacher nodded. "I heard you took in a woman. Claire, is it?" "I did," Jacob said, his voice defensive. "She needed help." "I'm not here to judge," the preacher said gently. "I'm here to remind you that grief doesn't have a timeline, and neither does healing. If Claire is helping you and Emma heal, then that's a gift. Don't let the town's wagging tongues rob you of it." Jacob stared at him, surprised. "You're not here to tell me it's improper," the preacher smiled. "I'm here to tell you that God's grace is big enough for both grief and joy, and if you've found joy again, even a little, then that's not betraying Sarah. That's honoring her." Jacob felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been locked tight since the day Sarah died. "I loved her," he said, his voice rough. "I still love her." "I know," the preacher said, "and you always will. But love doesn't run out, Jacob, it just grows. There's room in your heart for Sarah and for Claire, for the past and for the future. You don't have to choose." That night, Jacob told Claire what the preacher had said. She listened, her eyes wide, and when he finished, she said, "Do you believe him?" Jacob thought about it, about Sarah, about Emma, about the way Claire had fit into Sarah's dress and into their lives like she'd been meant to all along. "I'm starting to," he said. Claire smiled, small, tentative, but real. "Me too," she said, and somewhere, Jacob thought, Sarah was smiling too. Winter came hard and fast that year, the kind of winter that makes people forget what green looks like. Snow piled high against the barn. The wind howled like something alive and angry, and the temperature dropped so low that water froze in the buckets before you could carry it from the well to the house. Claire had been with them for 6 weeks when Emma got sick. It started with a cough, small, nothing worth worrying about. But by the next morning, Emma's forehead was burning and her breath came shallow and quick. Jacob carried her to bed, his heart hammering in a way he recognized all too well. He'd lost Sarah to childbirth. He couldn't lose Emma too. He wouldn't survive it. Claire moved through the house like a woman possessed. She boiled water, made poultices, pressed cool cloths to Emma's forehead, and sang soft songs in a language Jacob didn't recognize. She didn't sleep. She barely ate. She just sat by Emma's bed hour after hour, willing the fever to break. On the third night, when Emma's breathing turned raspy and wrong, Jacob sent for the doctor. But the roads were impassable, buried under 3 feet of snow, and the messenger returned alone, shaking his head. No one was coming. They were on their own. Jacob stood in the doorway of Emma's room watching Claire work, and felt something he hadn't felt since Sarah died. Absolute, bone-deep terror. Not for himself, but for the 2 people in that room. The 2 people who had somehow become the center of his world. "She's going to be all right," Claire said, not looking up. "I won't let her go." Jacob wanted to believe her, but he'd heard promises like that before, whispered in the dark by a woman who'd believed them with her whole heart, and he'd buried her anyway. "You can't promise that," he said, his voice raw. Claire finally looked at him, her face pale and exhausted. "I know," she said, "but I'm going to try because I've already lost 2 daughters. I won't lose Emma." The words hung in the air like smoke. Jacob's chest tightened. He crossed the room and knelt beside her, taking her hand. "You're not going to lose her," he said. "We're not." Claire nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I can't do this again, Jacob. I can't watch another child." She broke off, sobbing. Jacob pulled her into his arms, holding her tight while Emma slept fitfully in the bed beside them. "You're not alone," he whispered. "Not anymore." They stayed like that for a long time, 2 broken people clinging to each other in the dark, praying to a God who sometimes listened and sometimes didn't, but who was the only one left to ask. The fever broke at dawn on the 4th day. Emma's eyes fluttered open, clear for the first time in days, and she whispered, "Mama Claire." Claire gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here." "I had a dream," Emma said, her voice thin and tired. "Mama was there, the real Mama. She said I had to wake up because Mama Claire needed me." Jacob's throat closed. Claire let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and pressed her forehead to Emma's hand. "She was right," Claire whispered. "I do need you." "So much." Emma smiled, small and weak, and closed her eyes again, but this time her breathing was steady. This time the color was coming back to her cheeks. This time Jacob let himself believe she was going to be all right. Over the next week, Emma recovered slowly. Claire stayed by her side, reading to her, singing to her, holding her when the nightmares came. And Jacob watched them both, his heart doing something he'd thought it was no longer capable of, opening up, letting someone in, making room for a future he hadn't dared to imagine. One evening, after Emma had fallen asleep, Jacob found Claire in the kitchen, staring at the empty plate on the table, the fourth plate, the one that had started everything. "Thank you," Jacob said. Claire looked up, surprised. "For what?" "For saving her," Jacob said. "For staying." He stopped, struggling to find the words. "For being here." Claire shook her head. "You saved me first. Maybe we saved each other," Jacob said. Claire smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, it reached her eyes. "Maybe we did." Jacob took a breath, the kind of breath a man takes before he steps off a cliff and hopes the ground is closer than it looks. "Claire," he said, "I need to tell you something." She straightened, her smile fading into something more cautious. "All right. When Sarah died," Jacob began, his voice steady even though his hands weren't, "I thought that was it. I thought I'd had my one chance at love, and I'd lost it. I thought the rest of my life was just going to be me and Emma, trying to get by, trying not to drown in the grief, and I was all right with that. I'd made my peace with it." Claire waited, her eyes wide. "And then you showed up," Jacob continued, "and you were sad and broken, and you had no reason to care about me or Emma. But you did. You stayed. You helped. You loved Emma like she was your own. And I—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "I didn't mean to fall in love with you, Claire. But I did." Claire's breath hitched. "Jacob, I'm not asking you to love me back," Jacob said quickly. "I know you're still grieving, I know you're not ready, but I needed you to know, because life's too short and too hard to keep important things locked up inside. Sarah taught me that. And if she were here, she'd tell me I was a fool for waiting this long to say it." Claire stood up, walked around the table, and stood in front of him, her eyes searching his face. "You love me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do," Jacob said simply. Claire's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I didn't think I could feel this again," she said. "After I lost my family, I thought that part of me was dead. But then Emma called me Mama, and you let me stay and you treated me like I mattered, and I started to feel again, and it scared me, Jacob. It terrified me." "And now?" Jacob asked. Claire reached up and cupped his face in her hands. "Now I think maybe Sarah's been watching out for both of us. Because I love you too." Jacob let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was the most precious thing he'd ever touched, and Claire held him back, both of them shaking with the weight of everything they'd survived and everything they'd found. "Will you marry me?" Jacob asked, his voice muffled against her hair. Claire pulled back just enough to look at him, tears streaming down her face. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will." From the doorway, a small voice said, "Finally." They both turned to see Emma wrapped in a blanket, grinning like she'd just won a prize. "I thought you'd never ask her, Papa." Jacob laughed, the sound startling him with its brightness. "How long have you been standing there?" "Long enough," Emma said, running over and throwing herself into their arms. "Mama Claire's staying forever, right?" Claire kissed the top of Emma's head. "Forever," she promised. And Jacob, holding his daughter and the woman who'd walked into his life with nothing but grief and a canvas bag, felt something he hadn't felt in 2 years. Peace. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of something stronger. Hope, love, family. Outside, the snow fell soft and quiet, covering the world in white. Inside, 3 people who'd been broken by loss learned how to be whole again. One meal, one moment, one small act of love at a time. And somewhere Sarah smiled, knowing her empty chair had found its person at last. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it came with a vengeance. The snow melted fast, turning the roads into rivers of mud, and the whole valley seemed to exhale after months of holding its breath. Wildflowers pushed through the thawing ground, purple and yellow and white, like they'd been waiting all winter for permission to bloom. Jacob and Claire were married on the first warm day in April, in the same church where Jacob had married Sarah 15 years before. The preacher who'd told Jacob that love didn't run out officiated, his voice warm with approval. Emma stood beside Claire in a new dress that Claire had sewn by hand, holding a bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked that morning. Claire wore Sarah's wedding dress. It had been Emma's idea, of course. She'd asked one evening at supper, her voice matter-of-fact, like she was suggesting they have chicken instead of beef. "Mama Claire should wear Mama Sarah's dress," she'd said. "So Mama Sarah can be there too." Jacob had looked at Claire, waiting for her to refuse, to say it was too much, too soon, too painful. But Claire had just smiled, her eyes wet, and said, "I'd be honored." The town showed up. Not all of them. There were still people who thought it was too soon, who whispered behind their hands about propriety and respect. But the ones who mattered came. The ones who understood that grief doesn't follow a schedule, and love doesn't wait for permission. Mrs. Fletcher, who'd warned Jacob about taking in strangers, showed up with tears in her eyes and a quilt she'd made for the newlyweds. "I was wrong," she'd said simply, pressing the quilt into Claire's hands. "You're good for them, for both of them." Mr. Dawson, who'd come to borrow tools and stayed to judge, shook Jacob's hand and said, "Sarah would have liked her. That's all that matters." And Clara Whitfield, the old woman who'd been the first to tell Jacob the truth about his great-grandfather, sat in the front row and wept openly, whispering to anyone who would listen, "Love finds a way. It always finds a way." When the preacher asked if anyone objected, the church fell silent. Jacob held his breath, half expecting someone to stand, to say it was too soon, too wrong, too much. But no one moved. And when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the congregation erupted in applause so loud it made Emma giggle and bury her face in Claire's skirt. Jacob kissed Claire, soft and reverent, and she kissed him back, and the whole church seemed to sigh with relief, like they'd all been holding their breath, waiting for the world to give these two broken people permission to be happy again. The reception was held at the ranch in the yard where Claire had first appeared at the gate 6 months ago. Tables had been set up, covered with food the neighbors had brought. There was music, a fiddle and a guitar, and dancing, and laughter that rang out across the fields like a promise that better days were possible. Emma danced with everyone, with Jacob, with Claire, with the preacher, with old Moses, who could barely stand but refused to sit down when there was music playing. And when the sun started to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Emma tugged on Claire's hand and led her to the porch. "I want to show you something," Emma said, her voice serious. Claire followed, and Jacob trailed behind, curious. Emma led them to the kitchen table, where 4 plates had been set, the way they'd been set every night for the past 2 years. But tonight, there was something different. In the center of the table, Emma had placed a small vase with wildflowers, the same kind that grew near Sarah's grave. "I picked them for Mama Sarah," Emma said, "so she knows we didn't forget her." Claire knelt down, eye level with Emma, her face soft with emotion. "We could never forget her, sweetheart. She's part of us, always." Emma nodded, satisfied. "And now you're part of us too. So we have 2 mamas, one in heaven and one here. And that's okay, right?" "That's more than okay," Claire said, pulling Emma into a hug. "That's perfect." Jacob watched them, his throat tight with emotion. He thought about Sarah, about the way she'd always set 4 plates, always insisted there was room for one more. She'd known something he hadn't, that love wasn't a finite resource, carefully rationed and guarded. It was infinite, expansive, capable of holding grief and joy at the same time. That night, after the guests had left and Emma had fallen asleep in her bed, exhausted from dancing, Jacob and Claire stood on the porch together. The stars were out, bright and cold, and the air smelled of earth and new growth. "Do you think she's watching?" Claire asked softly, looking up at the sky. "Sarah?" Jacob asked. Claire nodded. Jacob thought about it, about the way Emma had called Claire Mama that first night, about the way the dress had fit, about the way everything had fallen into place like it had been planned by someone who saw the bigger picture. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think she is, and I think she's happy." Claire leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "I never thought I'd feel this again," she said. "Safe, loved, like I belonged somewhere." "You do belong here," Jacob said. "You always did. We were just waiting for you to show up." Claire smiled. "Thank you," she said, "for setting that extra plate, for letting me stay, for loving me even when I didn't think I could be loved." "Thank you," Jacob said, "for walking through that gate, for saving Emma, for saving me." They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other and the quiet of the night. Inside, the house was warm and full of memories and hope, and the kind of love that doesn't erase the past but builds on it, stronger and more beautiful because of what came before. Years later, when Emma was grown and had children of her own, she would tell them the story of how her family came to be. She'd tell them about Mama Sarah, who set 4 plates and believed in open doors. She'd tell them about Mama Claire, who walked through a gate with nothing but grief and found love waiting. And she'd tell them about her papa, who learned that the heart has room for more than one kind of love, more than one kind of family. And every time she told the story, she'd end it the same way. Love doesn't run out, it just grows. And sometimes, when you're brave enough to set an extra plate, the universe sends you exactly who you need. Emma grew up strong and kind, with two mothers guiding her, one from memory, one from presence. Claire never tried to replace Sarah. She honored her, kept her memory alive, told Emma stories about the woman who'd loved her first, and in return, Emma loved Claire with the fierce, uncomplicated devotion of a child who knew she was lucky to be loved by two extraordinary women. Jacob and Claire had 3 more children over the years, 2 boys and a girl. The house that had felt too big and too quiet became full of noise and laughter and the beautiful chaos of a family that chose each other every single day. They kept setting 4 plates. Even when the table grew and they needed more chairs, that original 4th plate remained, a reminder of where they'd started, of the tradition that had brought them together. And when guests came, confused by the extra setting, Emma would explain with the solemnity of someone passing down sacred knowledge, "That's for whoever needs us. Mama Sarah started it, Mama Claire continued it, and we'll never stop." On their 10th wedding anniversary, Jacob took Claire to Sarah's grave. It was something they did every year on Sarah's birthday, bringing flowers and spending a few quiet moments in remembrance. But this time, Claire had something she wanted to say. She knelt in the grass, placed the wildflowers gently against the headstone, and spoke as if Sarah could hear her. And maybe, Jacob thought, she could. "Thank you," Claire said simply. "Thank you for teaching Jacob about love. Thank you for teaching Emma about kindness. Thank you for setting that extra plate. Because of you, I found my way home. Because of you, I learned that broken things can be made whole again. I promise I'll take care of them. I promise I'll love them the way you would have. And I promise I'll never let them forget you." Jacob stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder, tears streaming down his face. And somewhere in the wind that rustled through the trees, he could have sworn he heard Sarah's voice, warm and full of love, saying what she'd always said when she was proud of him. Well done. The ranch prospered over the years. Jacob expanded the herd, built a new barn, and turned the struggling homestead into something he could pass down to his children with pride. But the real legacy wasn't the land or the livestock. It was the lesson they lived by, the one Sarah had started and Claire had continued. Always set an extra plate. Always leave room for one more, because you never know who needs a place at your table, and you never know how much you might need them too. And every night when the family gathered for supper, they'd bow their heads and Jacob would say the same grace he'd said since Claire had first walked through their gate. "Thank you for this food. Thank you for this family. Thank you for the people who've sat at this table, the ones who are here and the ones who are watching from above. And thank you for reminding us that love doesn't end. It just changes shape and keeps on growing." Then Emma, now grown with children of her own sitting beside her, would look at the 4th plate and smile, remembering the night a stranger had filled it and changed everything. And Claire would reach for Jacob's hand, squeezing it gently, a silent thank you for the life they'd built together, on the foundation Sarah had laid, with the love Emma had insisted was possible. Outside, the sun would set, painting the Montana sky in colors too beautiful to name. Inside, a family that had been broken would sit together, whole and grateful, proof that sometimes the best things in life are the ones you never saw coming. And somewhere, Sarah smiled, her work complete.